Oh, yes. I found it.
Okay, we are live now. Do you want to, in the meanwhile, welcome to the ones that are following. And we are back with Marco Bertaglia. And of course, in this session that is related to mobilization of youth and civil society, you cannot miss the experience of Extinction Rebellion. And we will talk with Marco Bertaglia about civil disobedience. And so I will let the floor to Marco to introduce himself and, of course, to let us know about the experience and the great action of Extinction Rebellion.
Thank you, Domenico. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here, and I'll try and be brief in my presentation to leave enough floor for discussion. So, Extinction Rebellion is, I'm myself a scientist, basically, mostly. I've been working on various aspects of sustainability, broadly speaking, and more particularly in agroecology, but also linked to climate, soil and biodiversity. Until the end of last year, almost a year now, with the Joint Research Center, which is the in-house scientific arm, independent scientific arm within the European Commission to inform European policies. As I find out that it didn't work, as nothing has worked in these decades to stir us away from the catastrophe that is impending. And I took leave and I live without pay, and I devoted myself entirely to the movement Extinction Rebellion. I've also been a trainer in nonviolent communication. That's my hat. That's why over 2 years ago now, when I discovered that something like Extinction Rebellion was born in the UK, calling for nonviolent civil disobedience in the face of the dramatic, tragic gravity of the climate crisis and the ecological crisis. And I mean, ecological crisis as sixth mass extinction we're in. I decided that this was the way to go, the last hope. And when hope dies, or it's almost nearly completely dead, action must begin. So why you know it? So I'll skip it very quickly. You know about deforestation, where over a third of all land has been deforested until 1990. Another 3% since then. We're going to have more plastic in the oceans, and then fish, and the air is toxic. It's not even air pollution we can mention it to be. Toxicity is so dire that almost all states regularly violate their own laws, and the toxicity kills more people in the world every year than malaria, AIDS, and tuberculosis combined. But most of all, we're in a climate and ecological emergencies of our making. We know by the climate, you know how it's going, ice disappearing, almost gone. So this will pass on very quickly because you know, as the glacier disappeared in Iceland or in our alpine valleys in Italy, year after year after year, and we've gone through catastrophe, disasters, impossibility to have food to eat very soon. Couple of decades, wars all over the places, and migration. Forest gone, more people at risk for flooding, and now the politicians pretend we can believe that they're doing something, like net zeros by 2050 in the new Green New Deal for Europe, which is 50% chance of hitting 2 degrees with all the dire consequences based on ancient calculation. What now? Board a plane? Would you board a plane that has 50% chance of crashing, where you're already on that plane and it's taxiing, ready for departure? Now, we are heading towards at least 3, if not 4, or even 5, if we factor in the models used by the IPCC, feedback loops due to the Amazonia degrading to savanna and the destruction of permafrost. We're even heading to 4 plus 4 plus 5 at the end of the century as global warming. And for each additional degree of warming, it's a billion more people that would not be able to live and grow food where they were born. So imagine 3, 4, or 5 degrees. That means 2, 3, or 4 billion people in 80 years unable to continue living where they would have lived. Oops. And that's not all. We are in the midst of the destruction of life. 40% of amphibians will go, 34% of conifers, a third of corals at least. One species in 4 is headed for extinction, 1 in 8 within the next couple of decades. Since I was born, over 60% of life in terms of vertebrate has been disappeared and completely, and it's still disappearing. Insects, flying insects are gone. And the importance of flying insects is so known. We have pollinators without which we have no food or little food left. But there are also key factors, key species in the web of life. So fish is also going because insecticides that are increasingly aggressive, like neonicotinoids, are insecticides that affect nervous system of insects, but also affect plankton and then fish. Sales skyrocket, and you study then what happens to food webs and fishery yields in lakes in Japan. You see a decrease from 24 tons to 22. That's 91% less fish. 91% less fish. Now I skip all that, but basic result of all this is war ahead. War. Because when resources dwindle, we haven't learned to do anything less than fight each other with violence. So we must immediately reverse the trend. And what can we do? Civil disobedience, that's what Extinction Rebellion calls us to do. Mass, non-violent civil disobedience. In the face of the inefficacy or insufficiency of all things, from scientists' warnings to marches, petitions, a host of studies and a host of practical projects that showcase good practices, from zero emission housing to food growing without pesticide, many demonstration projects, education, international negotiations. Nothing has been sufficient to avert the crisis, and we're still heading for disaster. So Extinction Rebellion thinks that we are desperate. We are very close to disaster. And all we can do is mobilize masses. Block, like in November 2018, 6,000 people, including myself, blocked 5 bridges on the Thames River. So it comes from the UK. It grew from an organization that only fought air pollution back before, in the 2 years previous to 2018, rising up. And one of the 10 funders in April 2018, 10 people in pubs were discussing this. This was Roger Allen, for instance. Some of you may know him. He managed to make King's College divest from fossil fuel, going on hunger strike, almost alone. Well, of course, not alone. There were other people supporting him. We follow principles of non-violence, of radical, total, complete, respectful non-violence, as showcased by Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King and other civil liberties movements. And this is the kind of fights that have been increasingly frequent around the world and increasingly successful. And what happens is, here you have this book by Strija Popovic, who is one of the co-founders of the Otpo movement, who took down Milosevic, the dictator in Serbia. But what is probably less known is that people from Egypt went there in secret 2 years before Tahrir Square. And they also went to Birmania to work with the monks that for the Saffron Revolution later, and in other places. Well, I mention here something just to say that wherever they went, whomever they spoke with, there is the answer was always the same. Oh, this works in Serbia, but it cannot work in our country. And this is something I've heard over and over again since I started connected with the British of Extinction Rebellion when they were seeking expansion in November 2018 and bringing the rebellion to Italy and to increase in numbers of activists who joined the movement in Italy. And I've always heard the refrain, and you can still hear it, that Italy is not the UK, cannot work here. The truth is it works everywhere. It's based on science. Chinovat and Stephen worked on why civil resistance works, studying 323 conflicts, violent and non-violent, between 1900s and 2006, analyzing details. And what happens? 53% of success of non-violent movements versus 26% of violent movements. More than double the success rate. And when people say it doesn't work, they sort of they almost half right. 53% is almost half of it having success. So we can fail with nonviolent civil disobedience, but we are more than twice as likely to succeed. And when it had to do with reversing tyranny, it was even more. The difference was even more. After 5 years, the probability to remain democratic was of 40% in case of non-violent movements versus 5% in case of violent movements. And non-violent direct action is respectful of other. It's deeply respectful, so much so that when the Brits left India, they weren't happy to go, but they went with deep respect for Mahatma Gandhi. Because you have no enemy when you do nonviolent direct action. You only oppose action that is destructive of life or unjust. So you have no enemy. You just want a change. And you do want change to the point that you sacrifice, you put yourself in harm's way, you make disruptive action, and you almost expect repression, because repression, from repression derives a boomerang effect against the repressor. And people do put themselves, people who are neutral tends to join, at least morally, the side that keeps nonviolent action in the face of repression. So we have three demands as Extinction Rebellion: the truth, immediate action, and a different way of choosing things together. The truth is that government must declare a climate and an ecological emergency, working with all institutions to communicate the urgency. Like the urgency is the urgency that the Environmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the twin institution in the United Nations, twin for the IPCC on climate, demand. Scientists say to achieve sustainability, we have to have transformative changes of everything we do. And now we have to communicate how serious the emergencies are with all means of communication, like we did for the pandemic. Now, we must act to halt biodiversity loss and reduce the greenhouse gas emission to a net zero by 2025, which I know is tomorrow, but it's feasible, although very difficult. It must be done, and it can be done. And we say by 2025 because that's what the science say. And we have to act as swiftly as if World War II had begun. Like in the US, in just a year, they converted all their industry into war industry and dispatched all arms they needed all over the world in just a year, with the logistic that they had in 1940. And now we want governments to create and be led by the decision of a citizens' assembly drawn by sortition on climate and ecological justice. And how we can want to achieve that. Like a year after 10 people discussed starting Extinction Rebellion in a pub, 10,000 people blocked the central key, 5 key areas of London, central London, for 10 days. Piccadilly Circus, Oxford Circus, Trafalgar Square, Marlborough Arch, Waterloo Bridge, 10 days, 10,000 people, with over 1,000 arrested. And that's mass civil disobedience. We have to fill the road in the capital. That's where the decisions are made, the elites are, powers are. We break the law to create a dilemma. So if you break the law, they must persecute you. If they persecute you, they know fully well you're nonviolent, you have what Gandhi called the power of truth on your side, you will be attracting attention. But if they let you do, then you do it. And what's very important is to maintain nonviolent discipline, like this activist, black activist in Birmingham, Alabama, in the 1960, 61, where it doesn't even react to the hound dog of the policeman there. And people who stand by, they cannot keep being stand-byers without somehow feeling ashamed or unease about what happens, and must, in the end, take side with the nonviolent activist. And it is necessary to keep going, not just one day and you do in the newspaper if you're lucky, and then everything continues as before. And we want to have a colorful, happy rebellion for 2 reasons: to include all sort of people and to mimic the kind of world we want, a world of regenerative culture, a world where people get by with between among themselves and with nature. And let's keep the organization of XR. If you have some information, some question you can ask, just to mention that we have, excuse me, the format of with the change between PowerPoint and another software. But you can go online and look at our website, extinctionrebellion.it in Italy, or you can find extinctionrebellion.org.uk in the UK, and you can find us in many countries, or you can go to rebellion.global to find us all over the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Marco, for showing us the movement of Extinction Rebellion and also the story that was important, in my opinion, also the origins of the movement and all the action that has led till now and how the movement is grown. So now the floor is for question. I saw that there are some into the chat. Maybe Giancarlo is yours. I don't know.
Yes, I've read it. Should I answer that?
Sure.
Yes, I'm fairly aware of what happened in Genoa in 2001 and what happens with black blocs. There are risks involved with everything we do, and there are certainly high risks in nonviolent direct action. Now, on one side, we can try and mitigate those risks, and we can be successful to an extent. And one way we do that is that we train ourselves in nonviolent direct action. We train ourselves in forming what we call affinity groups. There are groups of 8 to 12 or 15 people maximum who know each other very well, who are connected, who look at each other, and there's a buddy system, they're paired. And so if anyone gets from the outside, you find out it's someone you never seen, and you interact with them in ways that can try to either bring them in or contain possible violence. And there are a number of ways of to contain violence, to react to violence as soon as it starts. There are, of course, not necessarily always successful, but we test them and we try them and we train on them to be ready for that. Um, Now, what happens is police has changed tactics, and recently, with exception of course, but recently they tend to realize that if they don't repress you and they try to contain you in areas of towns that are less visible, you tend to lose you tend to lose attention. If they repress you, then you gain media attention and people attention. So there's a number of factors there that are at play there. And I close it quickly just to say, just saying the last thing is, as I mentioned in my presentation, we're not 100% successful. We're 53% successful to say it statistically with the studies that I quoted. So yes, there are risks, and of course, media tend to drag you down or not mention the good things that you do. That's a big issue. I fully acknowledge that.
Okay, one question from Pauline.
Uh, sure. I I can really relate with the melting sea ice. Especially, I was working on a project that was aimed at declaring Arctic Ocean a marine protected area because of the effect is climate and weather effect it had in Africa. So that I could really relate with well. On the other hand, I feel like I'm actually among the people asking if civil disobedience can work in Kenya. I'm trying to imagine the type of leadership we have and also the kind of the decisions they do make and also the roughness of the police, how they could really engage us when we try to do such an event. So before heading on, a question is that before heading on to the streets to engage on in civil disobedience, do you always engage the government first or tell them about your demands or you just hit the street? That's the question.
Okay, thank you very much, Pauline. That's an excellent question. And really, I first of all want to acknowledge the difficulty in many areas of the world. And I'm not intending in any way to say that people must do things or that it's easy to do things or that it's absolutely non-existent, that people run much higher risks in countries like Kenya than in countries like the UK. I fully acknowledge that. So before hitting the street, you can of course make sure that the governments know your demand. Uh, what happens is non-violent civil disobedience is meant in the transparent way, like Gandhi did. Gandhi said to the viceroy, "I'm going to do the salt march." "No, you can't." "Yes, I will do it." "Well, we hit you." "I know you will hit us, but that's unjust. We have to do it." And they did it. And if you remember, the Satyagraha would go walking towards the salt mines, the salt areas, and they wouldn't even raise the arm to be smashed with batons. But this was the time the international press highlighted. This was the time they said, New York Times, for instance, the Great Britain has lost any moral stance in this. It was the beginning of the end. They had lost. They had gone one way too far. Of course, sacrifice is high, but every single big change on the planet, both violent and non-violent, has been brought about by sacrifice and sacrifice alone. I mean to mention, for instance, a rebellion of Ireland, of the Republic of Ireland in Dublin against Brits. And the Brits was clever. They wouldn't kill them immediately. They would bring them into court and have a due process against as condemning them for treason, unless they restate their fidelity to the Queen and basically saying we didn't mean it. And they thought because they feared death, they would say, okay, we didn't mean it. We renew our allegiance to the Queen. But they didn't do that, and they were killed. But their killing provoked a revolt of everyone else and reached the independence of Ireland. And this happens over and over again. The Freedom Riders, the first black and white people who went down into segregationist states like Alabama, riding on the buses together. There were few, they were not all in the movement who wanted to do so. And the others would say, no, don't go, they would kill you, they would harm you. And they would go anyway and be beaten and killed and all we know. And because of that, the others couldn't stay at home anymore. They say, no, we cannot leave them. And then it becomes a mass movement. And so if you're 20, they can kill you. If you're 20,000, 200,000, it's more difficult. Of course, there are exceptions. We all know about Genoa. We all know about Tiananmen Square in China. But there are, when I mention these studies, is that some of these non-violent action happened in countries with the governments like you mentioned, with the repression that we can expect from governments that you mentioned. But the repression always backfires. And in the end, when you've managed to mobilize at least 3.5% of the population, you're absolutely certain you win. Sometimes it has sufficed to have less than 3.5%. Sometimes. Not always. But when 3.5% of the population were mobilized in these 353 non-violent and violent conflicts, in the non-violent conflicts, even with violent repression, they always won. I hope I've answered your question, Pauline. Otherwise,
Yeah, sure, you did. Thank you very much.
thank you.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if there are other questions, but I take the chance to, first of all, asking if there are other questions for Marco. You can write in the chat or eventually use the Q&A functionality. Even though I have one question that I asked you, Marco. Oh, there is one, maybe? No? My question is, I did know Extinction Rebellion from a few times. Also, I had the opportunity to know you and also the group of my city and about Extinction Rebellion. And one thing that I very appreciate is properly the practice of nonviolence and the practice of active listening. And properly active listening is something that I want to ask to you, because as I saw in the like group of Extinction Rebellion, this is very fostered. Also to like educate the members of Extinction Rebellion to like engaging in civil disobedience properly with a nonviolence approach. Can you tell us more about this aspect also of Extinction Rebellion, that is like constructing a generative society properly inside the community of Extinction Rebellion?
Thank you, Domenico. Yes, this is a question that is very dear to me. I mentioned quickly in passing that I'm a trainer in nonviolent communication. In our approach in Extinction Rebellion, we believe that we move towards a regenerative culture. We have 10 principles and values by which we abide. And one of that is really that we aim to move towards a regenerative culture, which includes dealing with conflict as soon as it arises in a constructive way, and having relatively short feedback loops and working together in a way that gives room to listening to each other within the movement and with all contacts with the outside. So basically, it's empathy is the basis of the approach to nonviolence, where we don't have enemies, neither within nor without the movement, but we want to change things and we want to create a world in a way where the means used are consistent with the end that we want to achieve. You cannot achieve a non-violent world by violent means. So you have to have an internal consistency. And there are, even as I mentioned, non-violence adopted for the pragmatic reason that it's more successful. So that's one aspect. And within the movement, there are even people who have a more in principle approach to nonviolence, more even spiritual for some. And these are tendencies that are different, but they cross fertilize mutually. The same is for nonviolent communication or active listening. It is more likely that will be listened to, and your requests will be listened to, and your reasons will be listened to when you listen to other people actively, when you open up. If I start to insult you, or use a language that you can receive as aggression, or or culpabilization, or blaming you about things you've done, then you close up. So that's been seen, by psychology, social sciences. You close up, and so I close the communication channels. I don't manage to reach you. And this is true for all sorts of interaction that we have within the movement, where we organize facilitations, we organize work in a distributed way. We have no boss, we have no vertical structures, we don't even have a completely loose structure. We had a structure that is created in working groups with mandates and roles, and very clearly delimited, and semi-autonomy for all sort of people in all sorts of working groups and local groups, within a context of mutual feedback and consistent listening to each other. Now, empathy, when you also are connected with politicians with whom you disagree entirely, even with police contact people dealing with police, now you just acknowledge the human being in front of you, and recognize their needs and their requests without necessarily be ready to abide by those. And then and then you open up a possibility of conversation, so that then you're also listened to when it's your turn. I have one experience, one example I can make. It was a lady who was so upset and furious about the kind of action we were taking, and so she was complaining that we should be more careful about what we do, that what we were purporting to do didn't make any sense, and she was living there and she knew, and so on and so forth. So I went there and I just listened. So you're annoyed because you want to be sure that we consider carefully all aspects before complaining. Yes, you have to be careful. You have to assess. You can things are much more complex. So you know that things are complex, and you want to be reassured that we give proper attention to all aspects of things. Yes, because you cannot just complain. You cannot just say this and this and that without knowing what's behind. And by listening to her for 20 minutes, I had the time in that occasion. It was calmer in that moment. She relaxed, she calmed down, she was listened to, she felt satisfied. And then I could say, can I say something now to you? And she, yes, please. And then I mentioned that, yes, we disagree. Extinction Rebellion wants citizens' assemblies so that you can say your opinion, I can say my opinion. We listen to the science, we listen to the different stakeholders, we dialogue together respectfully. You have your opinion, I have my opinion. And that choice we make, it's not falling on us from the top of a municipality, region, government, European Union, whatever, that decide for us. We decide together. And by the dialogue between us and mutual listening, we decide together. So it all fits together. Active listening within the movement, decision making, it all fits.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you very much also for responding to my answer. And So now we're gonna start the roundtable on youth mobilization and civil society mobilization. So I'll be coming to join the hosts and the guests of this session. Marco, of course, if you want, you are very kindly invited to stay. It will be properly a roundtable together with several activists from several movements. And of course, Extinction Rebellion is like inside the group that we are talking about. And for starting, but we will take like a 5 minutes break, like five minutes. You can take a coffee or something, and then we can start. In the meanwhile, we are waiting for the participant to come. So we'll stop the live session now.